Howdy y'all, my name is Dave, and this is the Anime Field Guide podcast. This episode is the Anime Production Field Guide, a top-level look at what it takes to make an anime and all the fine folks who make it all possible.
Here we go.
So yes, this episode is called the Anime Production Field Guide, and it is my general overview. It's not a one-for-one of all productions across all times, but it's to get you relatively familiar with, or at least have a better grasp and appreciation for the fine folks who work together to create the art that we all enjoy watching. Before I dive in, I gotta get the plugs out of the way. We can find me on Instagram, Threads, and Blue Sky at Annie Field Guide, A-N-I Field Guide, all one word in lowercase. We will also have a Discord server available for you to join. You can reach out through the links in any of those socials. We'd love to have you there. If we're talking credit sequences in particular, if you think about your opening credit sequence, this is typically listing your director level staff. So obviously the series director, the chief decision maker, and basically the face of the whole production staff if it's not just a studio. Also the character designer, any animation directors, your head writers, which is called like series composition. Not to be confused with the music composer or music composition. You also have credits for the band singing the really cool song, as well as the production companies involved, including the TV station. For your ending credit sequence, this is where you start getting your more episode-specific staff credits. So your episode directors and your episode script writers, your animation staff, and any supporting studios, including backgrounds, post-production work, all of that. Your voice actors, their agencies, any kind of recording studios. This is listing for a whole lot of work and manpower that goes into the animation process. So my goal with this episode is to present these roles and their place relatively in the production pipeline as straightforward manner as I can, and I will be doing this across three main phases. We start with pre-production, then we have active production, and then post-processing or any kind of post-production work. Some roles are, of course, exclusive to a production phase. Others have differing roles depending on what part of the pipeline we are. But typically, you will not find an editor working in series planning, nor would you expect to find a scriptwriter hashing out dialogue in the final editing room. At least I hope to God you wouldn't, because then you, my friend, have a problem. But yeah, the best place to start all of this is, of course, the beginning. First off, it's good to know that anime is typically produced in what we call a committee system. This is called a production committee. You basically have a group of stakeholders. They get together. They form a legal entity or what's called like a joint venture subsidiary company. And it's the goal of producing a specific piece of entertainment. So it could be a song, it could be a movie, or like I said, it's anime. So a whole bunch of companies collaborate and share the financial risk. It's also, of course, an investment opportunity via merchandising sales and such past the anime's runtime. And as these businesses are here for the express purpose of making the anime, they typically name the production committee after the title of the work being produced. And so the companies within this committee are represented by producers. These are people who act as the go-betweens of the company and the anime studio to make sure their company's money is being spent as intended, as well as any sort of creative mandates or, I guess, creative suggestions their bosses want handed down. Anime studios also employ producers to handle these negotiations, as well as logistics on any sort of existing projects they're trying to get off the ground, also promote the studio or the staff to potential creative partners. You can think of a good example I always like to think of is Toshio Suzuki at Studio Ghibli, who was basically built his entire career of marketing Hayao Miyazaki to the world. So now that we have our companies together, our producers are talking and agreeing, and we have secured funding for a project, the next step is to bring in the series planners. And these guys are generally in charge of assembling the creative staff and figuring out the production pipeline. I'm also going to list some key creative staff that will be brought in at this time. But on the planning side, you're basically bringing in all of the top level and key people. You're figuring out your general script, your storyboarding. You want to get your character draft solid, the overall visual style. Does any of the early decisions of, okay, what do we anticipate we need to have before we start bringing in people to actually begin production? Also, how many people do we think it'll take and all of that? So obviously at the top of the heap is the series director, or also called the chief director. They are the captain of the ship and resident helicopter parent. They oversee and approve basically every aspect of the production process once it gets going. They are typically regarded as the highest creative authority for decisions in the studio. So as we go through the various departments, just kind of keep the series director in the back of your mind, because they are, as far as, especially in a Japanese production, the series director is involved in literally everything. Naturally, because they have so much responsibility, they can also have a lot of input in the hiring process. Some directors also can have their own creative staff, or I guess people that frequent collaborators, I guess I'll call it, that can move with them. The chief director also works closely with the writing team, because one of the director's many responsibilities is to take the written plot and develop it into storyboards. And a storyboard is just a series of sequential drawings detailing the major scenes. This is basically the director's top level, like, grand vision. This is information for dialogue, camera movements, any kind of music direction, just everything. This is basically the master blueprint that the director uses to inform the key animators and the rest of the staff for layouts and all of their drawings. And it's, again, this is the master document for the project. Underneath the chief director are, of course, various assistant directors. So they handle tasks to free up the main director's time. It's also a good position for job shadowing. For TV projects, there will also be directly in charge of one or more episodes. The final approval step, they are before the final approval by the series director. Concurrently, we have a role that's not explicitly this person does this job, but it's a role called, or I would say it's a credit given as the episode director. So again, this is more of an episode-specific credit for TV production. So this person handled one or more episodes, being basically the series director handed off this episode to this person. And naturally, the series director or any of his assistants could also get credited as being an episode director if they were, the chief person in charge of said episode. There's also a movie equivalent. It goes under various names. You'll see it as, you can basically, the movie equivalent can be person in charge of scenes within movie. So let's get into the writing staff. So at the head of the writing staff is a position called series composition. And this is the head writer who drafts the overall series plot. How much are we going to write? How long is our story? If it's a manga, how much of the manga are we going to adapt? And where do we see ourselves getting from point A to point B? Underneath them and concurrently, you also have the script and screenplay, which is the head writer and their writing staff. So we have our grand vision. Now, how do we break this up into scenes or episodes? And so before we proceed to dive a little bit deeper, get a little bit more in the weeds of this episode, and I start talking about each department semi-individually, think of just each department as a pyramid. You have a chief supervising director at the top. They communicate directly with the assistant and series directors, and they're basically like the final approval step before handing it off to the chief director. So underneath the supervising director at the top, you'll have multiple teams of sub-directors in charge of quality control and further approvals, while also working alongside the artists that they are supervising. So it just breaks out a pyramid, or maybe like a family tree, if you want to think of it like that. Everyone is also expected to pull double, triple duty. So all of these directors and sub-directors are also in the weeds, taking on key animation tasks, just like the rest of their team. So let's get into the animation department. Again, supervising director of animation is also known as the chief animation director. So this is the guy at the top of the animation department, and the final approval stage for basically all the series animation. In some cases, actually, I would say in many cases, the supervising director of animation is also the character designer, because basically the character designer's job is to make sure all instances of character animation is consistent across the multiple artists on the project. But in this planning stage, the character designer is, of course, designing the characters, and they are producing what are called character drafts. These are your facial expressions. You have the character not just drawn one way, you have several different angles, your poses, anything that will be useful for the animation staff as a reference point. Naturally, they have a close working relationship with the series director and the art designer. Characters also need to stay on model in a work, and they as well as gel with the visual style of the series. So there's a lot of back and forth at this planning side. If you are adapting a manga, you also have additional considerations like how are we adapting the manga style to the anime style without deviating too far? Is there a good compromise we can find? So we'll revisit the animation department naturally in part 2 when we talk about the animation staff once the production actually gets going on. So we're going to move on to the art department, headed by the art designer, generally held by the senior most art director on the staff. So the art designer and the art department is responsible for the overall visual style of the anime. You can think of them as in charge of the world building. The art designer and the department is all in charge of the locations, the terrain, any backgrounds, objects or vehicles. Also, do you have any props, weapons, music instruments, things like that? So these guys work basically hand in glove with the animation department. They provide reference material for the animators to use on their layouts. So let's say there's an action scene with this very acrobatic character. Well, the key animator will have to know what space this character has to work with and also various contact points in order to properly execute a scene. You also have various subcategories of design credits that I will touch on here that can also fall under the animation department. So a popular one is mechanical design or / mechanical animation. So this is your robots and mecha, also planes, trains, automobiles, your spacecraft, also your creature design or your monster design and your creature animation, your weapons design and animation, armor, instruments, any sort of historical details you need to have just right. So we have our animation, we have our world building, and next up we have the finishing / the cleanups department. And at the planning stage, this is primarily the color designer. This person sets the main color palette for the series, as well as any sort of references for any other colors used in the environment, for how it will change with lighting, any sort of just any details that the finishing department and the coloring crew will need to know once production gets rolling. And this used to be a credit that was, say, rolled in with the art designer or some other chief director. It used to not really be its own thing, but when the industry moved more from cel and then went fully digital, you started to see color designer being credited to an individual more often, and now it's more or less a standard credit in the industry. So let's move on to phase 2 and start up the production pipeline. So the first department I will talk about is fittingly called the production department, headed by the production manager. Now, this is a person who doesn't have, or it's a department that doesn't have any direct responsibilities with the creative direction of the series, but this is a department all about logistics. The production manager keeps the schedule, they track benchmarks, they keep track of spending, concerns, and needs from any other departments, say like art, animation, the coloring, computer graphics. They also have their own top manager that is always in constant communication with the production department. What do you need? Do you need art supplies? Do you need technology? What do you need? This is the department that takes care of logistics. And throughout the production department, you have assistant production managers. And actually, if you want a fun little anime about the day in the life of an assistant production manager, check out Shirobako. That anime is basically all about a production manager's lifestyle, as well as touching on every other aspect of the series, but our main POV, point of view character, is an assistant production manager. Basically, these people handle the day-to-day operations of running the anime studio, so they are the gophers. They fetch and deliver materials between the departments, they coordinate with any outsourced or freelance work, they help schedule and print materials for staff meetings. They're the professional gopher. So let's jump back into the animation department. So again, they are headed by the chief animation director, followed by multiple layers of quality control steps. And so the animation supervisors is generally the credits given to these quality control steps. You also see this credit listed as animation direction. So it's not animation director, animation direction. And so we go from the supervising levels down to boots on the ground. And so I'm talking about the key animators who are the heart and soul of any project. Every project, in my opinion. They are responsible for drawing the keyframes, which are the primary moments in the animated sequence that will determine the scene's motion. And so prior to drawing out their keyframes, these guys will create a layout, which is basically they'll take the director's storyboard and whatever cuts they're assigned is what's called the collection of scenes. And they will expand that storyboard. They'll create a layout, and then they will draw the scene based on timing, how many frames does it take to throw this punch or do a backflip. And after the key animation is done and approved, we have typically the most outsourced part of the project or any project. You have the in-between animators. They fill in the gaps between the key animators' drawings to complete the full sequence of animation. Based on the timing sheet provided by the key animator, they also clean up or smooth any rough lines. Completed animation is then sent to the finishing department, which we will get to later. So jumping back into the art department, naturally headed by the art designer who handles the big scope of the work. Under them is the art director or art directors. They supervise and manage the aspects of the art department on a more episodic basis, particularly with, say, background artwork. These guys ensure the visual consistency for the backgrounds and props for their assigned scenes. Obviously, you have the backgrounds team who produces the background artwork. It's also worth noting that there are a fair number of support studios that are almost exclusively work on backgrounds, or maybe they also provide in-betweens. Some art directors, I've also noticed, have their own background or support studios. So sometimes you bring in an art director and they just bring their whole staff with them to work on a show, or part of their studios working on the show. A separate but related department is the computer graphics department, headed up by the CG director. So this is your animation production supervisor. The CG director assigns scenes to the CG artists, as well as providing creative input. They closely work with the chief animation supervisor and directors to meet the needs of each episode, while you also need to make sure your computer graphics blend with the animation. So you have the CG animator, which you can think of the CG animator as a equivalent to the key animators, just on a computer. They compile or render shots, and sometimes they do entire scenes using CG. And then you have the digital artist, who renders effects work and any other artwork via CGI to, again, supplement the animation. A lot can be done in computers, but you got to make sure it blends well. So there's a lot of checks that go in, a lot of communication that needs to be done between the CG department and the art and animation department. This brings us to the finishing department. I told you we'd get here soon. We have the color selection credit, which is a person who works under the color designer. And again, this is an episode-specific color palette, as well as working with the color designer on characters and objects that may not have been created in the pre-production phase or maybe need to be adjusted afterwards. You also have the coloring selector and coloring designer are also in charge of quality checking this final animation with all the elements now in place. This is one of the last stops before the full animation is colored, and this is one of the last stops before a full scene is completed. Also, in today's industry, you'll see a credit for digital coloring. So these are the artists and or studios in charge of the DigiPaint. And again, another set of double checking that completed drawings alongside any sort of animation touch-up. This includes the finishing inspector, which I usually see a finishing inspector on like larger projects like a movie. And the color selector may just have too much on their plate to also handle inspections. So sometimes they'll bring in a person and give them that credit as they are also working in the department. And another credit from primarily the cell production days is finishing touches, which of course sounds redundant after I just talked about the inspector. But this is where artists would touch up the celluloid sheets, apply any sort of color or outlines, whatever was needed to, again, touch up the final frame. And this one was, again, pretty much phased out by the digital coloring aspects of modern productions, but I felt like including it here. So now we're in the home stretch. Phase 3, we are in post-production phase, and I'm also going to mix in a couple of other related things as well. So to kick things off, I want to talk about the audio department, or I'm pretty much calling it the audio department. In a lot of cases, anime studios may not have their own entire recording or audio segment. There are entire studios, there are entire audio and recording studios just for that. You also wouldn't typically have your music composer, the guy in charge of your soundtrack, may not be in charge of your may not be employed by your studio on a permanent basis. You'd bring a guy in to do your soundtrack. But nevertheless, under the audio department, you of course have the main musical composer, the guy in charge of your OST. Audio department is headed by the audio director. This is a credit in charge of directing the voice recording sessions, as well as confirming the music selections with the composer. And again, very vital to the production, you have your voice cast. These are your vocal performers who voice all the characters. Any voice talent agency the actors are part of typically get credited, usually alongside the actors after it's done. So again, they're not necessarily part of the audio department, but I mean, obviously they work with the audio department, and that's a whole different side of the industry with their own producers and agents, and that's a whole organizing all of that is with different staff. And of course, same thing with the musical artists, like your theme songs. And so a lot of the times with the audio department, it's really the series director. They will actually sit in on all of the vocal recordings. So in a lot of cases, the audio director is sitting there with the series director, and they're both kind of nodding along and going, okay, is this take good? Is this take good? Okay, we're going to go with that. Next scene, please. The audio director also organizes and catalogs the musical tracks by type. Then the episode director and everyone can determine where they want those music tracks to be placed within the show. Another credit from the analog days is what was called the music selection credit. So this would be the staff member in charge of organizing and cataloging all of the sound libraries before digital libraries made that task quicker and easier. So under the audio director, again, they are in charge of the vocal recordings. So we also have a recording director. They typically work for the recording studio, and they are the person doing all of the vocal recording aspects of the project. They will also mix the audio tracks together. So this is dialogue, music, sound effects, and send it off to the editing department to then later combine with the completed animation sequence. This also includes the sound effects editor. So they are in charge of collecting and or creating and editing the sound effects for the series, as well as maintaining the sound effects library for the recording studio. I will also include the voice cast and your music artists here because we're just on the subject of audio. So obviously the voice cast is your vocal performers who do your characters in the anime. Also any voice talent agency the actors are part of get credited as well. The music artists, your theme songs and any sort of cover music, as well as their talent agencies get their credit, as well as any sort of recording studio. So that's just all just under audio, which is very much in a post-processing stage. But they also record lines relatively in conjunction with rough animation. So it's something that's constantly happening, but you need a couple of episodes in the pipeline before you start bringing in the audio department full time. So moving along very briefly, we have the visual effects department. This is the department in charge of explosions, lightning, earth, water, wind, fire, clouds, Kamehameha. Modern shows, of course, employ all kinds of digital effects, your filters and CGI. Like some shows are just, wow, there's so much going on. So you used to have specialized animators for effects work, and you still do. They're still around. But again, the computer filters and effects have done a lot of replacing for what used to be, again, an analog process, particularly explosions. Like if you got a guy who can draw a good explosion, then man. Next, we have the compositing department or photography, headed by the director of photography. So they are the supervisor for, again, the overall compositing of the work, as well as any guidance concerning light direction. Do we need to focus or blur segments? Any lens flare, any sort of air quotes, the camera placement to enhance the atmosphere of a shot. This is something, again, a storyboard direction would see. I also don't really see a director of photography on projects unless it's a large project like a film or a larger anime series with a lot of episodes or just a lot of production value in it. But I felt like including it as well. What you do see across the board is the photographer or the digital photographer. The word here in the compositing department is consistency. You want to maintain the same scale across the entire project to reduce what was called jitter. So this was those slight variations in angle and scale in between frames. So the photographer, they would layer everything together and they would take photographs of the celluloid, then line it up to where you would have a completed scene. So this is, of course, another role that has been heavily changed due to the march of technology. Compositing software has pretty much done away with the need to manually assemble and photograph all these layers of celluloid. And so our last stop is, of course, the editing department, who puts it all together. They join the photographed sequences of film together to complete the moving image. The editor then combines the recorded audio from the audio department and with the complete and colored animation sequence. And at the end of the day, they throw it all together, and that's how you have a final episode of anime. And that concludes our top level tour of a typical anime production staff breakdown. I hope this helps for the next time you watch an anime with the English translated credits, or want to track down a person from that show that did that thing or drew that thing that you thought was really, really cool, and now you want to see what else they did. I hope this episode was helpful. I want to thank you for listening until the end, and I will catch you on the next one. So until then, stay safe and watch more cartoons.